Hello, everyone. Welcome to our series on good clinical practices. These are extensions of the Ultimate Clinical Research Toolbox, and these are additional presentations and trainings that get rolled out monthly or every other month so that you can actually understand the management of clinical trials, but it also expands on a lot of the terms that you have on the Ultimate Clinical Research Toolbox. And so, from a clinical researcher perspective, it's going to give you additional ways to look at how clinical trials are actually conducted. It's also going to help with some of the definitions that you struggle with, or you've taken the course and there are additional questions that you have regarding some of the terms that are being used. So this is our first session, and during this session, we're going to start with what a good clinical practice is really, and how do they apply to me as a clinical researcher. So the version that we're using is the GCPS that was integrated by the FDA in the US. We had some changes in the ICH GCPs, which are the International Conference on Harmonization, Good Clinical Practices. They've been around for a while, and in 1990, they were created. And then in 1996, they became the ICH GCPs. 2015, the International Council on Harmonization was registered as a non-profit organization with these GCPs. 2016, they were revised. They did an initial revision, which was revision 1, and then they did revision 2. I mean, just look at the distance from the time period between 1990 and 2016. So many changes happened in clinical trials, particularly decentralization, innovation, the use of technology in clinical trials. So that changed a lot of things. The version that you're getting trained on is the one that was adopted and released by the US FDA on the 1st of March of 2018. So what are good clinical practices? They are an international ethical and scientific quality standard for designing, conducting, recording, and reporting trials that involve the participation of human subjects. Now, compliance with this standard provides public assurance that the rights, safety, and well-being of trial subjects are protected, and they are consistent with the principles that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki, and that the clinical trial data are credible. 2 points that I want to make regarding this first part of the definitions. It is an internationally recognized standard for conducting clinical trials. And so what it really focuses on is standardizing these practices so that everyone who's involved in running clinical trials across the world has a point of reference and standards. But at the center of clinical trials, remember, it's the right, safety, and well-being of clinical trial subjects. And that is the key takeaway. So every rule and law that is being created in clinical trials always has safety of trial subjects as the foundation. And then, of course, it is consistent with the principles of the Helsinki Declaration. In this network, if you are taking this coaching program, you're obviously part of our Blue Cloud, Achaibo Blue Cloud network. In Blue Cloud, there are many free courses in there that we roll out to you, which has the history of clinical trials and all the different periods and all the changes that have happened. The Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, and all those different time points that have caused this standardization of clinical trials. So this piece will really help you to understand more of the courses that you're taking in Blue Cloud. So the GCPs are influenced by the European Union, Japan, the United States, Australia, Canada, Nordic countries, and then, they have Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, and then there are also other territories that are actually involved, and the World Health Organization. So these are the core countries in clinical trials. But of course, there are many organizations that are also a part of it, and they also have different committees and chairpersons that do different things. So that's a brief background. I wanted you to understand this, and let's go right into the principles, okay? So the first principle is that clinical trials should be conducted in accordance with the ethical principles that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki and that are consistent with GCP and applicable regulatory requirements. What does this mean for you? That when you are conducting a clinical trial, you have got to make sure that you are running it ethically, right? And that it is consistent with these principles. And that's really important. The next point is that before a trial is initiated, foreseeable risks and inconveniences should be weighed against the anticipated benefit for the individual trial subject and society. A trial should be initiated and continued only if the anticipated benefits justify the risk. Key takeaway is the risk-benefit ratio. You have to do it in such a way that the risk is less than the benefit, right? So let's say I'm conducting a malaria clinical trial, and what we found is that some of the side effects of that drug are, shakes, maybe headaches. So those are some of the risks, but the benefit to the patient outweighs that they get cured of malaria, and they feel better. But if you have a product that you're researching and the product, causes more risk to the patient, maybe their arm falls off, right? Or, they take a drug, their arm falls off, but the drug is supposed to cure, a pimple that is sitting on their face. So see, that's the risk that's a lot more. So these are what are really risk, the really outweighing risk versus benefits. So the next one is that the right, safety, and well-being of the trial subjects are the most important consideration and should prevail over interests of science and society. So here's my point. I mentioned it earlier. Rights and safety and well-being of trial subjects should supersede everything. Think about this, if you're a member of your family is participating in a clinical trial and they're being used as a guinea pig, and when I say being used as a guinea pig, which means that they're being abused, because there's a myth out there that, clinical trials use people as guinea pigs. They do not. It is the safest healthcare procedure or healthcare management that you can actually have as a patient, because the rules in clinical trials and the way that they are managed supersedes any care that you're going to get in a healthcare facility or a clinic. It's just set up that way, right? Because these are products that are being tested. So again, if you are a clinical researcher, everything that you do, whether you are at a clinical research site, your patients are always number one, and everything that you do has to be to protect those patients. If you are on the sponsor side or working for a pharma company, whatever role that you have, whether you're writing a protocol or you're monitoring data, whatever it is, you should always focus on making sure that the implementation by the facilities of the rights and safety and well-being of the trial subjects is actually ongoing. Next, the available non-clinical and clinical information on an investigational product should be adequate to support the proposed clinical trial. So this typically has to do with the data that is conducted maybe preclinically, and then when everything finally goes into the study of this new product. So you always want to make sure that whatever clinical trial that you're proposing in the US, it's an IND, it's an application for an investigational new drug. They would have a lot of data that has already been put together based on research that is non-clinical. And then there was also clinical information that is adequate to support that proposed clinical trial. So those are things that are actually put in place that are really important. The next principle is that clinical trials should be scientifically sound and described in a clear, detailed protocol. The protocol is the Bible of the clinical trial, and then every other thing on the trial is an offshoot from that. If you're a clinical research site and you get the clinical trial protocol, many times you get other binders, you get a lab manual, you get all these different documents that actually support the protocol. Remember this. Ultimately, it's the protocol that overrides everything. So, for example, let's say the protocol states that blood has to be drawn at a specific period. You look at your lab manual, maybe there's an error. You might want to bring that up to the company or whoever is the sponsor or who is responsible for the product that you're studying, because it's the protocol that caps everything, right? In whatever, whether it's if you're if you receive manuals on which you have to manage data and there's an error that contradicts the protocol, then you have to bring that to the sponsor's attention as well. So always remember that the protocol supersedes every other document, because that's where everything is actually detailed. Okay. A trial should be conducted in compliance with the protocol that has received prior institutional review board or independent ethics committee approval or favorable opinion. This applies to clinical research sites. So before you conduct a clinical trial, you typically have to submit everything to an independent ethics committee or an IRB, and they are the oversight for the sites. So that's who will approve you to conduct this clinical trial. And there are so many things that are involved. There's a whole section on what IRBs are and how they actually function in the ICA GCPs in Blue Cloud. You can take a look at that. But here, just know that that's the oversight body that's over clinical research sites. They get certain documents. Typically, they get the protocol, the on all the study documents, and then they have to review them. And it is the letter that they submit to you which says that you can now, all the documents are approved and that you can actually proceed. That is what actually triggers you conducting the clinical trial. Okay. Next, the medical care given to and medical decisions made on behalf of subjects should be the responsibility of a qualified physician or, when appropriate, of a qualified dentist. In clinical trials, the principal investigators or sub-investigators are always qualified physicians or qualified dentists. And in other cases, based on the country where the clinical trial is being conducted, there are other personnel that can actually make a qualified medical decision on the subject's behalf, right? So that's a layer of oversight. You are responsible for making sure that these patients have medical care given and medical decisions that actually are made for their well-being. Next one. Each individual involved in conducting a trial should be qualified by education, training, and experience to perform his or her respective tasks. This is extremely important in clinical trials, hence the ultimate clinical research toolbox. So you might have the education as a physician or surgeon, but you don't know how to conduct clinical trials, because that's a whole different field. And so it's basically we are making sure that you are mirroring. So you are merging or mirroring or putting together your medical skills, whether you're a physician, you're a pharmacist, you're a nurse practitioner, whatever you are in healthcare, and you want to be a clinical researcher, we're making sure that those medical skills are there. But in addition to that, we have to make sure that you understand these GCPs, you know how to implement them, and how to actually manage clinical trials. The next part is really important. Freely giving informed consent should be obtained from every subject prior to clinical trial participation. This is, I call it the Pandora's box principle, because when it comes to informed consent in clinical trials, there is so much that is involved. I mean, there are different types of informed consents, but the key takeaway is that when you're administering an informed consent, you have to do it before the patient has any procedures done. That's what happens. That's the patient has to take the informed consent. They have to have time to understand what the clinical trial is about. They have to have time to sit with the medically qualified person who's in charge of the trial to explain it to them. There's so many things involved. If there are people who might need a translator, there are informed consents for minors, right? Those are called assents. And then there are people who need legal representation and informed consent for protected populations like prisoners. So the big takeaway is that these different types of consents are always there to ensure that a patient understands what they're getting themselves into. The next point is that all clinical trial information should be recorded, handled, and stored in a way that allows its accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification. Clinical trials are very good at documentation. There is a way to document everything from the database that we use to capture information, and then from what sites are documenting. There's a specific way to make corrections on paper forms. We have source documents where the site captures information and it enters it into the database, and then that's one piece. And then from the pharmaceutical research sponsor side, research institutions, all the databases that are used have audit trails. There are many checks that are put in place to ensure that this is accurate, it is stored, it is confidential. And that's very important in clinical trials because, again, we are dealing with the lives of human beings. And so we have to make sure that however things are set up, information has to be recorded, it has to be handled in a specific way, it has to be accurate, right? I mean, we don't want to submit erroneous information regarding a clinical trial. And this should be verified. The next point is that the confidentiality of records that could identify subjects should be protected, respecting their privacy and confidentiality rules in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. Again, patient confidentiality. You can think, if you're listening to this and you're a clinical researcher, safety of subjects, part of it is confidentiality. This has to do with people's private lives and their personal lives, and you cannot share this information there. And you have to make sure that you follow all the rules. In the US, we have HIPAA, which is the Privacy Act, which protects all of that. The next point is that investigational products should be manufactured, handled, and stored in accordance with applicable good manufacturing practices, the GMPs, and they should be used in accordance with the approved protocol. There is a whole procedure for how investigational products are manufactured, the good clinical manufacturing practices. There's so much information about that. You can Google it and you can take a look at it. It's really to ensure that the products that are actually being studied are safe, right? And they have to be used in accordance with the protocol. So you cannot have products from a clinical trial and you're using it for anything else. It has to only be used for the approved protocol. Okay. The next point is that systems with procedures that assure the quality of every aspect of the trial should be implemented. So we talk about quality assurance and to really make sure that we are monitoring whether it's the data or it's the way that the trial is being conducted. And we have to make sure that these systems are in place that ensure that there is actually quality ongoing in the clinical trial. So that's it for the principles of ICH GCPS, our first session. The big takeaway for you is that when you listen to this, wherever you are on your clinical research journey, you actually want to think about how that is applicable to whatever it is that you're doing. Because we're all in clinical research to ensure that the patients are safe, and everything has to grow from that. So I thank you for listening to this session. We have more coming up, and we're very delighted that you're here studying and understanding what clinical trials are about so that you can have a skill set that is transferable. It is a skill set that can be used anywhere in the world, right? And if you're a clinical research site, pay attention to this information and keep thinking about how you can use this to ensure the safety of your subjects. Thank you.